Just tell me when.
Daughter's happy that she's coming, so.
Ready? Good afternoon. Thank you. Welcome to the Special Committee Police and Community meeting. Today is August the 27th. It's 3 o'clock. My name is Councilwoman Ortiz. I represent District 3, and I'm the chair, and I'd like to ask my other two colleagues to introduce themselves if they would. Also, if we'd have everybody around the table go ahead and introduce themselves if they would, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Councilwoman Karen Hiller, District 1.
Mike Padilla, District 5.
Chief of Police Brian Wheelis.
Assistant Director of Training, Ruben Salamanca.
Brent Trout, City Manager.
Thank you. First order of business is the approval of the minutes from July 30th.
Move to approve.
It's been moved to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, raise your right hand. 3-0. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
Okay.
All righty. I also like to welcome those that have Zoomed in today. Next is the field training officer, and I will turn this over to Police Chief.
And I'll immediately turn over to my right here and hand it over to the Assistant Director of Training, Sergeant Ruben Salamanca, to begin that portion of the presentation today.
It's good to have you back, Salamanca.
Well, thank you. So what I'd like to do today is kind of give you guys a little bit of a more step-by-step process of not only the selection of our field training officers, but also the qualifications and some of the metrics that we use to recruit and then train our field training officers when they train, our recruit officers when they bridge over to from the academy setting into the field operations setting on the street. So as you can see, what I've done is, as we go through this training process this morning to kind of educate you, is I'll just kind of take you through a virtual tour of from beginning to end, how the police training division facilitates the field training program. So as you can see from step one of the first things we do is we try to solicit officers, of course, the most qualified officers from field operations, and we advertise that through email. We push that email out, being very clear on the fact that we're seeking qualified applicants, and then those applicants that are interested will submit a memo.
You might slide that the one on the right to the other.
Swipe the little joystick, or? Okay, I'm sorry about that. So as you can see, just kind of a quick breakdown, and I believe we provided a more comprehensive breakdown of the qualifications. Now, the qualifications, generally, every year we put out these qualifications seeking field training officers, which are the primary trainer of the recruit when he hits the streets, and then also field training supervisors. And for the most part, the qualifications mirror one another. One detail I'd like to point out, though, is where the field training officer trains the recruit for a period of 4 cycles. Generally, each cycle is a different training officer, with the recruit returning back to the first training officer in phase 4 during the solo evaluation, and we'll kind of cover that in more detail. One of the unique differences, though, is the field training supervisor actually is assigned the same recruit throughout the entire 20 weeks. And the purpose for that is that we want to develop that rapport and that communication with the field training supervisor in the event there's a lack of chemistry or some kind of disconnect between the trainer and the recruit. So that seems to be a very effective formula. And plus, that field training supervisor follows that recruit throughout the entire training phase, unlike the field training officer who will change recruits throughout the 20-week period. So after we push out the advertisement, seeking the applicants, what you're seeing here is an example of what a memo might look like from an officer. This is an actual memo. I just redacted some personnel information from that, names and things like that, but hopefully you guys get the gist of it. So the memos will come directly to training, to the director and to myself. We spent a lot of time reviewing these memos, of course, highlighting and capturing information such as specialized skills, certificates, licenses, abilities, a background. And then we also, after we review the memos, we'll sit down, we'll discuss those memos. If additional information is provided, such as employee evaluations. If they're not, we will seek out assistance through human resources and look at performance evaluations as to what type of officer they've been graded as. And then we review these documents as well to try to make, obviously, the most educated decision on who would be the most qualified person. Additionally, you want to go ahead and forward that for me, please? I'm not sure what's going on with the clicker. Here's kind of more of an itemized listing of some of the things we're looking at. If the officer's really interested, oftentimes they'll get letters from their supervisors, from the lieutenant or sergeant. They'll also include, instructor experience. And then, of course, the big thing we look at, which is something hard to measure, at least in writing, is their attitude towards police work. Generally, we're a decent-sized agency, but for the most part, every officer that works there has their own reputation. So we look at that as well. What kind of character they're bringing, what kind of temperament they're bringing. Are they someone that is, that we think could be contribute positively to the program? At current time, one of the things I will tell you in the time that at least I've been there, this program has been in a constant state of evolvement. In the 3 years that we've been there, we are constantly looking at ways of doing things better. One of the things that we've changed is we've placed more emphasis on not just the recruit. He has a responsibility to bring his A game each and every day, but also on the instructor. So we've put a lot more culpability on the instructor in developing and honing his skills so that there's a better pairing between him and the recruit. And so the program, even as we speak right now, by the time it reaches the chief's office, it'll be even more robust and more vigorous. As an example, some of the things we're looking at is an actual interview process where the FTO will actually come to a committee, and we will have a series of questions as in a way to try to figure out if his heart's in it. I mean, that's a big piece. You got to have the passion to do this kind of work. So we're trying to do that. Also, maybe encouraging or requiring more frequent training. They do get a training in this program annually, but we're looking at developing maybe a quarterly or even twice a year where they get training just to constantly refresh their skills, because at the academy, we run academies back to back, so we're constantly putting officers out on the streets. So we want our officers that are training them to stay to evolve just the way the training academy staff is doing. So this is an example of training that we just finished for the current batch last year that are in cycle right now. Our current crop of 11 recruits that are on the street representing Class 59 are scheduled to be released September 3rd will be their final day. We are doing field training supervisor release boards on that date. And this right here is just a listing of classes that we covered, training that we covered in a 3-day period in 2 different blocks, training approximately 27 field training officers and supervisors. And as you can see the list, we're very proud of the list. As I stated, I think it mirrors and reflects training going on in the academy and also the development of the field training officer himself. So we're teaching them to be teachers. Most of them are already qualified officers that are conscientious, that use good safety and are tactically sound. But we're trying to really educate their minds and trying to turn the learning dynamic it's not about the instructor, it's about the recruit. And we've been successful, and I'm proud to report to everybody, this is, in my memory, this is the first time that everybody looks that they're going to be released. And this is going from a 24-week training academy, 24-week field training phase, which Lieutenant Cross spoke about on July 30th. We actually reduced it by 4 weeks. And we realized that it's not about the length of the training, it's actually about the content and the quality of the instructors. So we hope that we're successful with Class 60, who they graduate in October, and they'll hit the street as well. Our next field training that we're putting out has already been scheduled. Those are the dates there. I would invite committee members, you're welcome as our guest to come sit in on any blocks of the training. If you can make any of this, it is any particular time block, I'd be willing to share with you guys also an invitation as to if there's a particular topic that interests you, but you're welcome to come in there and sit there as a fly on the wall, if you will, and observe how we train them and how we set our expectations. That's the current crop of recruits that are getting ready to be released on the street. They're in their solo phase as we speak. and they are hard chargers. We've got really good evaluations from them. Of course, from the academy where we provide most of the education. Now they've been in a position for the last 19 weeks to do all the work that we've taught them in a more practical application, putting all their skills that we've taught them in the academy to work, and our results have been the results of this change have been more effective, and we've received a lot of positive feedback also from our instructors, because I think through the training that we've done, it also has empowered them as instructors and also as police officers. And so once they do that piece, getting ready to hit the streets, actually before that, about 2 or 3 days before they hit the streets, I forgot to mention we've been doing this every academy. We have what's called the recruit meet and greet. So the reason for this is that we don't want to stick a recruit officer and a field training officer who've never meet the first day at roll call. So what we do is we invite all the field training supervisors and all the field training officers to come to the academy. We set aside about an hour or so where they could just, like it says, meet and greet, call it a speed dating, call it what you will, but it's a time for them to start to develop that initial chemistry, and also for the field training officer to give them some of the nuances that, we can't cover everything in the academy, where to go, where to sit, where to park your car, some of those small things as a new officer, leaving an academy setting since we're off site, going to headquarters for the first time. There's a certain amount of anxiety in that, so we try to alleviate that by assigning them to their new supervision, where they leave the supervision of the academy staff. Now they fall into the supervision of a field training officer, which is an extension of us, but we feel this is a pretty important thing we do, and it's been very well received. We've even brought in past graduating classes to come mingle with the recruits and kind of to help alleviate some of the anxieties, because I can still remember when I went to field training, it's a pretty nerve-wracking experience. You're going to be spending 10 hours a day with a complete stranger. So this is a model that's been very effective for us. Once we're completed with that piece of the academy and they hit the streets, this is what I do. This is one of my responsibilities, is the pairing. So as you can see here, that's an example of the current crop of recruits that are out on the streets right now. As you can see, each shift is color-coded. So the first shift, second shift, and then third shift is off screen. And then I will pair based on the strengths and weaknesses of the recruit, and of course the FTO, where some FTOs, and depending on the shift they work, they're going to be exposed to different types of calls. And so what we try to do is each phase, as you can see with that phase, the first one started in October, I may assign that recruit to first shift with an officer that he's going to that officer on day shift may have more opportunity to orientate that recruit, show them around town, show them some of the landmarks, some of the places that we go, some of the services that are available during day shift, maybe city court, some of the places that are not available after hours. So the second phase, I might put that recruit maybe on second or third, depending on how successful and what kind of skill level they're demonstrating. I might stick them with a different type of field officer to get him exposed to maybe say DUI enforcement or things that occur after hours. And that's kind of the model that we use. It's been very effective. We seek feedback. When the FTO has completed training the recruit, we ask him what are the strengths and weaknesses, what are the areas he or she needs to improve upon. And then we talk to the field training supervisor and we ask them for recommendations. And then about 2 weeks prior to the end of that cycle, we're pairing them with another field training officer. As you can see there, as I just spoke, phase 4, which Lieutenant Cross spoke about, the last committee meeting we had, they're in that phase right now. Right now, that's a solo phase in which the field training officer, he is in uniform, okay? So the field training officer is even though the recruit is in a solo status, the expectation is that he or she is to operate as an individual officer. It's a culmination of the training for the 3 phases. So basically, the field training officer is there to observe. So when I say observe, I mean we're not going to put the recruit in a situation where, he's on his own, but he has to start acting independently. He or she has to start thinking independently, and then utilize his radio and other resources when needed. And the FTO will only step in matters of officer safety or some type of moral or ethical issue arises, or if the recruit just completely has a meltdown. That thankfully hasn't occurred, but each FTO is given specific instructions on how to handle this phase, because in times past, You may or may not have heard of the term shadowing. We've got away from that shadowing many years ago. Field training officers were actually allowed to be in plain clothes, and that became problematic for a variety of reasons. He wasn't identifiable as a police officer, and it just wasn't safe, it wasn't practical, especially when you're going to a particular crisis or an emergency. And then, of course, you see on that final column, that's a column we don't like to use, but we will if we have to, depending on the strengths and the performance level, which is the extended phase. If at the end of this phase, the recruit has been deemed that he or she is not ready, then we will do everything in our power to try to remediate that recruit and get him or her back on target. As you can see from that column, it's empty, and we have with early detection and intervention, it appears it's going to stay that way based on my conversations with the FTOs. And now we'll kind of transition into the database. What I'm trying to accomplish today is just give you guys from start to finish where they're at in the beginning, where they land, and then where it ends up. The database has also been refined. Training has a very, very good relationship with IT. Our city IT at the department has been just phenomenal in helping us make our database. It was very antiquated. When I went over there 3 years ago, it was very old. It hadn't been touched. It hadn't been made a little more. It wasn't used. We weren't using it for what it was capable of. And so we sat down with IT. We looked at ways how to implement a better grading system, most importantly, how to query the system. More often than not, if somebody was looking for my name, you'd have to page through multiple pages to find that. So we put engines on there where you can search easily. You can isolate specific things. Every 6 months after a training phase, we audit the system. We treat the system as a kind of a right to know, need to know. We don't want anybody in that system except people that have the privilege, which includes training staff, the field training officers, and commanders. And the reason for that is sometimes, we FTOs will get promoted or do a lateral transfer, and they really have no reason going in there because they could compromise information in there. So we train our field training officers to treat everything in this database as a personnel file, because ultimately this personnel file represents the beginning of this employee's permanent training record. And so we realize that it's subject to subpoena, it's discoverable information, so it needs to be treated as such. And that's been a very good model that we've used, and everybody seems to understand that. In that database, what you'll find is several examples. We're going to go through 4 of those examples. The first thing is a daily review. If you remember the last time we spoke, we talked about that we used to have a numbering system, which is known as the San Jose model. And the San Jose model has been around for decades, and most agencies embraced it because before the San Jose model, there was no model. And so most agencies, including Topeka PD, embraced that. A few years back, we started looking at it, and we realized that it was just too subjective. We had field training officers, we had recruits. In one phase, they were getting 1s, 2s, and 3s. In the next phase, they were getting 5s and 6s. And then the next phase, they were back down to 1s and 2s. And the reason for that is that using a number system just wasn't an effective way to grade, because every field training officer had a different perception of that. We sent some officers about 1.5 years ago to start researching what's called the Reno model. And without going into too many details about the Reno model, because it's a pretty exhausting model, but there was a lot of features in it. And through me talking to several academies around the country, and of course in Kansas, what we found out was that each agency is different, and what may work for one doesn't work for the other. So we ended up with is a bit of a combination or a hybrid model of the two. There was certain aspects of the San Jose we liked, and there was certain aspects of the Reno model that we liked. So where the daily observation report used to be a numbering system, we created more of what we call a running narrative. So as you can see there, I know the font's kind of small, I apologize. This is, it appears to be phase 1 of recruit's first day, and you could read the comments that the field training officer is making about the recruit. So the recruit will transition through this, and as you can see here, this FTO here, by this phase here, which is phase 3, as you can see the chronological order in which this officer is going to calls, and you can see if you take a few seconds to read, you can see the officer does a really good job of articulating the type of call that they went to and how the recruit responded to that type of call. So every time a recruit goes on a call, they're in a constant state of learning. In my experience, in the last 3 years I've been in training, we've only released 2 recruits early. What that means is they were absolutely stellar. And what I mean by stellar is it was intuitive. This job it was like it's like they were born to be a police officer. It's extremely rare that we even allow that. Our position is that you can never have enough training. But we have had sometimes lateral transfers from other agencies. They have that basic understanding. But as you can see from this narrative here, everything that this recruit does, there's something to be learned from that experience. Second thing we'll talk about is the core competencies. Now, for clarification, the daily report is done as it's self-explanatory daily. The core competencies are 16 core competencies in which the recruit is graded on weekly. So at the end of the week, the FTO will sit down, and I'll go through a series of additional slides, and he or she grades that recruit on several categories. As you can see, one of the first ones is attitude, appearance, things of that nature. Now keep in mind, the job is very fluid, and you may spend an entire week without working a particular call, so the recruit is not always exposed to every single type of call, which is why we try to move them around in shifts in different parts of the community. But as you can see there, the recruit is grading the FTO, the FTO is grading the recruit. As you move down here, you can see additional categories. I'm sorry, go ahead.
A quick question.
Yes.
And this is really great stuff. So, but we've been talking a lot about, more in the council meeting than here, about meets expectations. When a brand new recruit is being graded on meets expectations, is that kind of calibrated to their newness in terms of how they're rated, not the long-term expectation?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and we have, and depending on the type of call, there's recruits that they may be natural problem solvers, for example, and they are quick thinkers, and they are quick to establish rapport or have better communications than others. So what we're looking for is consistency, though. So if a recruit meets expectations, and we expect that consistency, when we see a digression in that, this is when we pull the FTO in for counseling, going, what is going on here?
Okay.
And what we find out sometimes it's the teaching style. And then we'll reveal that a little later in the presentation, but you're absolutely right.
Just check in to see what that means at that point in time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And another one of the reasons we shifted to that is that when they are released to a solo status, that is the City of Topeka evaluation for the Topeka Police Department. So we wanted to create some consistency because that's how they will be graded and evaluated when they're a solo officer. So we wanted to kind of bridge that early on so they have a better understanding of that, in lieu of the number system.
But they also understand that more is expected of them once they finish training.
We don't want them to plateau. We want a steady rise in that and the performance as they.
That's what I thought. I was just checking though. I mean, rather than saying, "Wow, you've already skated up to expectation level."
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. And then there's a couple more slides. I just really wanted to illustrate the point of how, the type of notes that they're taking, the types of observations they're making, and of course how they're articulating, how the FTO is articulating what they've seen in a 40-hour work week. So this, of course, requires the FTO to take a significant amount of field notes throughout the shift, constantly monitoring the recruit, and then at the conclusion of each call, sitting down and discussing the recruit. And the reason, there's a couple reasons for this. We don't want any surprises. We want the recruit to know each and every day how they're doing.
Wow.
And so we added an additional layer on that, and I've broken down a couple just to qualify. I know that I talked 16 core competencies, but people might be wondering what do those mean. So what do those mean? But so what I did is I've kind of expanded on those, what acceptable, superior, unacceptable kind of mean. So for example, you can see that's a working definition that we use in training for officer safety. And so this helps kind of with the FTO try to remove that subjectivity in how he or she is grading the recruit. They can look at these evaluation metrics and ask themselves, are they, one of the things that trainers tend to do, and not just our industry, but in a lot of industries, is they have a tendency to compare the trainee with their own experience. And that's one of the things that we really try to hit when we train them. You can't compare a 6-month recruit officer to a 10-year officer, or even a 5-year officer. It's almost like parenting. The model's just not going to work. So we really work really hard on getting the FTO to grade them fairly based on what their performance is and based on where they're at in their training evolution. And so you can here see another one, field performance, just again, more working definitions for you to kind of glean at. Interview interrogation skills. These are skills obviously very, very, very important in our job. Communication skills is absolutely critical. And their relationships with citizens is also extremely important. We know our officers about 98% of the time we're talking to people. So that's something that we place a lot of emphasis on with our, not only our FTOs, but our recruit officers. Many of them in the beginning, they're very shy, they're very introverted, and we teach them that you have to come out of your shell and you have to be able to communicate with people. Relationship with cultural and diversity and ethnic groups. That's another piece that we added because we think that's important. And although the old system kind of captured it, we wanted to be very specific to that so we can monitor that early on to see if there was any areas of, say, a lack of cultural competency, or if the recruit became more frustrated dealing with someone with a language barrier or someone that was different than that officer. So we wanted to really kind of focus on those kind of things as well. That was important to us. And so far the model has been successful. The second piece of that is the self-awareness or the self-assessment. One of the things that I instituted in the academy was every quarter the recruit is required to fill out a self-assessment form. Weekly, when the FTO is grading the recruit on the core competencies, the recruit is actually grading himself or herself as well. So while the FTO is grading him, the recruit will also have access to this database. It's a secure section just for the recruit, and they will grade how they think they are doing. And now, if there's a huge gap or inconsistency between how the FTO views their progress and how they view their own personal progress, and that could be a problem. And what we have found is there seems to be actually more consistency. Typically, a recruit knows that if during the week or during that particular cycle that they have continually made errors or have had lapses in judgment, it'll be reflected on the daily report. It'll certainly be documented in the recruit self-assessment. As you can see there, you can see the word I. So this is where the recruit now takes responsibility for things that he or she could have done better or is still learning. And this is a powerful piece, just kind of being aware of your own strengths and weaknesses. This creates dialogue between the FTO, and it creates dialogue with the field training supervisor on areas that they need to improve upon.
I have a question,
Yes.
if I may. So in this area on self-evaluation, do you feel that they're being honest? And if they're not being honest, the recruit does his self-eval, and then the training officer does his, right?
Yes.
And if the two aren't, do they get to see each other's? Is that what you're saying?
They do get to see each other. Well, yes, they do get to see each other's. But to answer your first question, one of the things that we've done, and as I just stated, is we are already conditioning them to think and act, and we also empower them. And in the academy, this practice of self-assessment is already something that they've been doing for 24 weeks in the academy. So this is not something new to them. And you would be surprised how honest and how candid they are. When we first instituted this program, that was the number one reservation that a lot of my peers were worried about, that recruits were not going to be honest. But it's very insightful, the honesty of today's new police officer. Not only are they critical about their trainers, because every academy instructor is evaluated, and some of them could be downright nasty, I guess, depending on the quality of the instructor. If the instructor did not bring his A game, the recruit is quick to point that out in a constructive way. So since we practice this 6 months in the academy, this becomes kind of a cultural norm for them. And when we get to the actual FTO being evaluated by the critique, I'll kind of reinforce that even more. It's just a consistent practice that they do. So now that where the supervisor is now being evaluated, my experience in short is, yes, they appear to be honest. You never know 100%, but our FTS, who has that rapport with the recruit, the recruit understands they have access to the field training supervisor, and they have a relationship with that field training supervisor, that if there is something going on, or if there is some intervention needed and the recruit is holding back, then we do our best to try to identify that.
But I think this is their opportunity to say, I need help in this area.
Yes.
And you know, you're only as good as your trainer or your teacher.
Yes.
Actually, you should be better than your trainer or your
Yes.
teacher when they get done. So if they haven't learned something or something didn't come across, that's where my concern is. And I just want to make sure, are we looking at these assessments, are we looking that they model up to that?
Yeah, we understand that, and like I agree with you 100%, that a recruit's failure is also our failure. So we have to, we take that very seriously. We spend thousands of dollars in an investment when we recruit a new applicant, and they go through a very rigorous hiring process. And so one of the things that we've changed over the years is that the FTO has responsibility in that. It's not just for whatever the program or incentives that might be there for the FTO, or just for the fact of being a field training officer. We remove all vanity from that. And I think that even I was guilty of that many years ago when I was a recruit. There was trainers in the department that were not qualified, and they were only training for their own personal gain or notoriety. We have changed all that, and we continue to change that. And we heavily scrutinize our FTOs to ensure that's not happening. We want them to own that. The same way that if in the academy setting, if one of our recruits doesn't pass an exam or a quiz, we have to constantly look back where the recruit has a responsibility, but were there things we could have done better? So it's always one of those things. We're always getting a mirror and looking at ourselves. And I can tell you that I hold each and every field training officer responsible. I read these regularly, and Lieutenant Cross, who's been there just a short time, we've come to agreement that we're both going to tackle this problem because of for a number of reasons. We want to make this put the recruit in a position to be successful. So.
And I thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Do we have any more questions before we move on? Councilman Padilla, followed by Clarence.
Just a quick question, Sergeant. In the self-assessment, and just by the explanation you just gave, in the ongoing continuous feedback to keep on top of issues that can be addressed, the thing that it comes to my mind, and maybe it's intended, maybe it's unintended, but I think for me it says that the recruit is learning all through the training phase, and especially at the self-assessment piece, that they're responsible for their actions, good and bad. And in a self-assessment, it, I think, moves to the issue of integrity, that I get used to telling
The truth.
that, yeah, I did something right, or yeah, I did something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if and when something happens that someone says, well, you didn't do the right thing here, could you have done it better? They have to have, I think, a mindset that has already been prepared for accepting that responsibility for success or failure, and being willing to say, you're right, Sergeant, what I did was wrong or not complete. And so being honest about that, I don't want to say failure, but about that need for improvement, I think has to continue throughout your career. And if you're doing this at the very beginning, I think it goes, again, I don't know whether you're doing it intentionally or unintentionally, it happens. In my mind, I start thinking, well, at least this way it builds some trust that I have that when Sergeant Salamanca and I get together and something's come up, he's going to be more apt to admit where there was need for improvement rather than defend a bad decision just because I want to be defensive about what I chose to do.
Yes.
So that's my own personal piece that I think I'm getting from this in addition to everything. And again, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but if you train that way, I think that's how you're going to respond when things don't go the way you want them to.
Yeah, it is definitely an exercise in humility. And humility is very close cousin to integrity. When a person can admit they've done wrong and want to improve, then they're on the path to doing great things. And as I stated before, in the academy setting, I'll be honest with you, we have recruits that come to us, that knock on my door or any of the staff's door thinking they're doing more poorly than they are because they're so humble and they want to learn more and they're a little hard on themselves. So even in this model, which is the identical model that we use in the academy, more often than not, they grade themselves lower than they actually are. They own things, mistakes. I'll give you a quick example. We had a high-risk car stop about a month or so ago involving a recruit officer, and the recruit officer made a very fatal, could have been fatal error in tactics. And so I was notified about it. I tasked it to the field training officer. I had every confidence the field training officer was going to address this. They created some mock scenarios and did some remedial training. Timing is everything. At the conclusion of that training session, they went to the streets, and guess what they encountered? A high-risk car stop involving a felony. And the recruit, not only did the recruit respond to the situation, he responded exactly as his training taught him to do. So that reinforced. But anytime we have detection like that, especially in matters of safety or life and death in that particular situation, and the recruit responds, it tells us that he's listening, he's humble, and he wants to learn, rather than, like as you stated, making excuses or not owning it. So intentionally or unintentionally, I'd be lying to say that was my plan when we did this, but so I won't take credit for it, but it has shown at least a more humble recruit. And it reveals the outliers. It reveals the recruit that maybe is there for different reasons, and maybe we don't want that person in the department. And that's also a sign of poor character. So that does help us identify that.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Karen?
Some reactions, but first a question. How long did you say you've been doing the package as you're describing it right now?
Approximately 1 year, but where it's at now, it wasn't at a year ago. It
Okay.
continues to evolve and continues to just grow legs, and even when this cycle finishes, the chief doesn't know it yet, but we're going to be having even further discussions of refining it.
Well, I'll tell you, I love it, and I'm perhaps because we're arm's length and we've been so buried in the police community conversations, I may see more of it than you do. And so the couple of reactions are that the two-way review is what I always did, and I found it so valuable because it allowing both parties to fill it out beforehand, and then both of them looking at what each and the other had written is very confidence and quality building, because there's this opportunity, and you're not only reviewing that person, but they've got the opportunity, like you're talking about with the reviews of the FTOs and so on, or the training officers and the supervisors, to give feedback too. I mean, when we've talked about some other things, not even just with the police department, the feedback you get from the rank and file as well, they just don't trust the management to be fair. And if there's not a feeling that there's a way to be part of making sure that the whole system is good for everybody, that can be discouraging or divisive. But when there is a way that you're welcomed to give feedback on the whole system, it helps you and it helps everybody. And I think that's just wonderful. And in part, what I'm seeing is the comparison to the ABLE program that we've been talking about, where you didn't just whoever was your supervisor or was evaluating you or was a senior to you, whatever they said, you just had to suffer with and go. Instead, you're starting to build, basically I don't know if you've done that corresponding
Yes.
thought yet, but I mean, it's building that function of we're all up and down needing to be our best every day.
Yes.
I also found, because I've done it for years, that issue of the grading and people's self-grading, when you're both going to look at each other's, most people don't want to find their supervisor scoring them lower than they did.
Yeah.
And so it's a good self-correcting process for humility, and correspondingly, I think you made some reference to it. If somebody's consistently scoring themselves higher than their reviewer, that tells you something too, and it really makes it in a way easier to work with because it's right out there.
Yeah, and off the top of my head, we've had recruits that have done that, and they're no longer employed here through no fault of ours.
It talks to you.
We had one that was caught lying, and another just a hot mess. But I mean, it is very revealing in how,
is.
and that's the
But it's a
emotional-
check, it's a very,
Yeah.
very natural check and balance. And so,
That's the emotional intelligence piece that we cover in the academy, the self-awareness, where you're at, who you are as a person, and what you bring. And so far, it's been effective, and the recruits, even as this cycle comes to an end, I'm getting emails from recruits talking about their FTO experience, and they've all been very positive. So, okay.
it's good.
And I brought that, are you done, Karen? Mm-hmm. Okay, I brought that up for a reason because we did this, and I remember one of my coworkers was just flat out lying. You know, of course, you don't want to go to your supervisor and say that, but I mean, she scored really high on hers, you know, on her self-evaluation. And I'm saying, I need this, I need this, I need more in this area. But at the end of the day, it showed that when she resigned, you know, and I kept telling my supervisor, like, she's lying, you know. And she bought books, stacks of books with her work undone, when every day she'd say it was done. And, you know, and so it is hard, you know, because you got those that want to be up there, but it is kind of a check and balance, you know.
Yes.
And it gives that person an opportunity to be honest and say, I need help in this area. I don't understand this. You know, whatever it might be. Because
Absolutely.
there's so many areas that you guys cover, so.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
No, not a problem at all. And then this is the biweekly reviews, the field training supervisor, at a culmination of the two core competencies, the field training officer core competency, the reviewing of the daily reports and daily narratives, and of course the self-assessment that the FTS will review. Depending on the discretion of the field training supervisor may have a one-on-one meeting with the recruit away from the FTO in case there's something that the recruit needs to report, or there's some issue going on that maybe he doesn't want to put in writing, or depending on the situation, he may have the meeting with the recruit and the field training officer. What I want to share here with you is just an example of a particular, what a biweekly might look like. As you can see here, we look at consistency. You know, we look at the daily narratives, we look at the core competencies, we look at the self-assessment. All those three should equal this. Okay, so what we tell our trainers is that if two or three, you know, if the narratives are not there, if the documentation is not there to support the assessment, then you have failed in your documentation. And that's ultimately what this comes down to. And we place that burden on the field training supervisor when he analyzes the information, the paperwork, and has the meeting. And in this particular case, you can see this officer is right where we want her to be, in progress. So my experience has been if this is multiple paragraphs or even a page long, there's probably issues. So
Don't look at the word.
Yeah.
Just
So when I was pulling up these, I wanted to get one a little more wordy, and I was thinking, but you know what, they don't exist because our recruits are doing very well. And so what you're going to see here, even in the next one here, this is a recruit here that on day one, this recruit made a felony arrest on day one. And that may not seem like that big of a deal, but what we were most proud of, and what the Shawnee County Sheriffs and TPD, of course, she's a TPD officer, but Shawnee County Sheriffs also witnessed it. Her assertiveness, her reactionary time to a person with a significant size disparity, I might add, and her first day on the street. They actually sent us an email going, you guys have a really good recruit officer in this particular recruit, because day one, they're usually afraid of their own shadow. And consistently throughout the program, we were going to produce what I believe to be a quality officer come September 2nd, because her progress has been stellar. We're very proud. She's one of our interns that we hired from out of state a year ago.
Here too.
Yeah. Additionally, on top of the database, that was the database that we just obviously discussed. They also have additional requirements. The field training officer and recruit have what's called the field training task list. And as you stated, there's so many, you cannot work, there's not enough time for training to to put the recruit in front of every situation they're going to encounter. It's just too complex of a society we live in. So to try to combat that, we've also created what's known as the Field Training Task Book. The Field Training Task Book was a part of the San Jose model, and it had pieces of it that we thought were very valuable, which are types of cases and types of calls that the recruit must show proficiency in before they're released. And it's amazing that even in 20 weeks, the recruit still may never work a sexual assault case. It's just sometimes just the law of averages. So what we'll do, if that happens, what the field training officer is required to do is he may go spend half a day with a special victims unit and be orientated on that, and maybe do a dry walkthrough on what that call will look like on a dry run, just to get the experience, because we will not pass that recruit to be released to the street until he gets that scenario-based experience, because through no fault of their own, you may not get that call. And that's a good thing. I mean, maybe our sexual assaults are down, right? So we don't want, it's not something we wish, but depending on there's a lot of variables in that. So the task book, when they come to the field training board, we've made it abundantly clear to every recruit that book must be completed. Field training officer and the field training supervisor need to sign off, because that is part of the permanent training record as well. A little screenshot. This is just a small screenshot of various activities that the recruit needs. The FTO needs to expose. The book is much more in depth than this and breaks down through all the phases, but I just wanted to share with you the types of calls that are not maybe necessarily built into the core competencies, and more like a tick sheet, I guess, if you want to call this, for lack of a better phrase, community policing, accident investigation, things of that nature. We require an officer or recruit to be exposed to that. And generally speaking, they're exposed to a lot of these types of things, so we generally don't have a problem. But once in a while, we might have a recruit who's never worked a DUI, and our FTOs are very creative when it comes to recreating scenarios. At the end of the training phase, if the recruit has been successful, again, this is not only just it's an actual memo, but again, removing some of the personnel information. We'll receive a recommendation letter, and the recommendation letter will come either from the field training officer, field training supervisor, or both, depending on the situation, and they'll make a recommendation directly to training. Based on the strength and veracity of that memo, we review that memo like we do all memos with a lot of scrutiny. And by this point, we're pretty confident, because of the early detection program we have built in the database, we generally know who's going to be released and who isn't. And we're very timely in reporting that to the chief's office. So there's no type of confusion or, we were saying something that wasn't occurring. We try to be very, very timely with notifications. And based on the strength of that memo, we will schedule a release board. Contrarily, though, once in a while we get a memo like this, where throughout the training process, the performance of this particular recruit was just subpar. Each and every training phase, despite all of our efforts, despite moving him or her to different field training officers or supervisors, despite additional training or remedial training, the recruit is just not at the place where we want him to be. And so those are discussions we'll have with the chief's office, with the bureau commanders, and basically to let them know that this person maybe needs to be extended. And what you see there is a request from an officer directly to me, outlining. Now, in this particular memo, this was about 3 or 4 pages long. And we sort of kind of knew already it was coming. And so it was very easy for us to take that to the chief's office and articulate the reasoning of that. I mean, the fact of the matter is we need officers on the streets. And so when this occurs, it's timely that we do everything we can. And we've been very successful. As a matter of fact, there's officers that have been here 20 or more years that they were extended. So it's not a scarlet letter or a badge of shame, and we tell our recruits that. Sometimes people just need a little longer that light bulb to come on, and it will happen for you. Just keep putting your best foot forward. We also understand training fatigue. That at some point you're training for 15, 14 months straight. We've got to be sensitive to that as well. So we do a lot of, we will pair that person with optimistic, natural teachers. We'll do everything in our power to try to put that person in a position for an extension that they will be successful. And so far the formula, that has worked. more so than it has not worked. So the extension of training, as I just repeated, it's a non-responsive training, or as we call an NRT, and we do everything we can coaching that person to get them back on track. So again, it's not a punishment. It's just a reality of the job. Not everybody learns, and not everybody's going to comprehend the same way. Ultimately, if the recruit is released, in times past, we used to have the recruit show up to a field release board, and he would show up in his Class A's and his hat and the crook of his arm, and he would answer a series of questions. And depending on the types of questions, depending on the environment, the nervousness of the recruit, sometimes they knew the answer in book form, and sometimes they didn't. And it wasn't always an effective way to release a recruit, because we felt that it really wasn't telling us a whole lot. Even if you went in there and you answered the questions, all that represented is that you were book smart and you probably studied statutes the night before. And we kind of re-examined and asked ourselves, why do we do the release board that way? And of course, the answer was because we always have. And in training, we kind of live by the adage, if it ain't broke, make it better. Not if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So as part of the evolution, we kind of re-examined that. We spoke to other academies, cities our size and cities bigger, cities smaller, and what are they doing? And one of the things that they said was that in order to empower the field training officer and the training staff, we need to not only make them responsible, but also own some of this. And so now what we're doing, and what we're going to do on September 2nd, is the field training officer and the field training supervisor will come to the committee, which we made up of myself, Lieutenant Cross, and field operations commanders, and they will make their voice known as to where the recruit is at and why or why not they shouldn't be released. I can tell you confidently the recruits are getting released, but it gives the voice. And what that has done is it has empowered our FTOs. In times past, they felt they didn't have a voice, and even if they made a recommendation for an extension, that always wasn't, they weren't always appeased. So now we've put the ownership on them. And what that has done is it has increased the documentation, it has increased their articulation, it has increased a number of things, because now they're responsible for that recruit. And as we stated in the first session we had, as Lieutenant Cross stated, we bring back the first phase field training officer. So in the fourth phase, the person that trained him the first time should see evidence of improvement, because it's been 18 weeks since he first had him in the car. And that's not only that, there's also that, you always remember your first field training officer. I still remember mine. There's that relationship piece there. And in some cases, we even tell them, I know it's tempting to be friends right now, but right now they're your supervisor and he's your recruit. After you're done with the training phase, you guys can be best friends, but right now there's that professional separation. But more often than not, we end up becoming friends with our field training officers, especially if it was a good experience. My training officers were still very, very good friends to this day. It's been over 20 years. You just always remember that relationship that you build.
Was that Mr. Padilla? Was that?
No. Dominic Yancey was.
Oh, he recruited you? Oh,
Yeah,
all right.
he's a good friend of mine.
He's made some good recruits. I bet a couple.
And so, as you can see here, these are the types of questions that we ask our field training officers. The most obvious, do you feel the recruit is ready to release? And they have to explain that. And what we've seen is if the database and everything that we've already talked about is in line, this should be an easy explanation. Mm-hmm. Do you see improvements in the recruit from phase one? Please explain. Well, we hope at this stage of the release board, we're going to be wowed with all the fantastic, phenomenal things this officer has done, especially since this FTO hasn't trained them for the last, at that point, 8 weeks, 8 or 12 weeks. So another question is, since they're getting ready to be released to a solo status, what are some of the things that the zone sergeant or the new command structure should watch for? Is there any areas you think that could a little bit more grease on the wheel, a little bit more help? A real common characteristic of a new officer is they tend to be a little robotic in how they communicate with people. That's a very common thing, and it's very normal. And with time and experience, they become more fluid in their communication style. So we want to be able to report that to the zone that he's going to be released to. How would you rate the recruit? Then we have a variety of questions. If the recruit is released, are you willing to check in? That's another piece that we've added. The FTO is not only an FTO when he's in a training phase, he's an FTO throughout the entire year. So even if he doesn't have a recruit under his supervision, we feel there's a certain obligation as a field training officer when he took on that role to spot check his recruit, to check on him from time to time and utilize that relationship that they built. And our FTOs, for the most part, have been very responsive to that. And during this field training release board, we will ask them that question. And then at the end of that, if they're successful in the boards, if the FTO and the FTS have all their ducks in the row, so to speak, then the chief of police will receive a memo similar to this, outlining the process of the board and our recommendations. At the conclusion of that, the recruit officer will transition under the command of field operations. However, they are still under that 18-month training phase, so that is not the end of their training. All that means is they have proven themselves to be under a solo status, and they have proven themselves to operate independently, but also they are subject to be returned to the academy or be returned under the auspice of a field training officer if we start to see a digression. And we will, and through the collaboration with us in field operations, we will bring that person back. Again, not as a punishment, not as a scarlet letter or something, but sometimes we have recruits that once they get on their own without the comfort of their security blanket, their training officer, sometimes they need a little more help. Proud to say that's extremely rare. Matter of fact, most recruit officers do better on their own without the supervision of someone always constantly reminding them what to do and how to do it. I can still remember my own experience on my own. It was almost like a coming out celebration when you're finally able to be your own person and police in your way, in your personality. And once he's completed the probationary period, Chief of Police will make a recommendation to the city manager that he is to be classified now from the change of status from recruit officer to a Topeka police officer with all the rights and privileges that go along with that.
Madam Chair, if I may,
Yes, you may.
pardon me for an interruption. I like the previous slide that you had up there where you were talking about the questions that are asked of the FTOs. Do you feel the recruit officer is ready for release and so forth? I really like that piece because I can't remember if you said that that's kind of new or
Yes.
an adjustment, because I really do think I had jotted down a couple questions, but what you presented answered some questions for me, because I think it's important that FTOs are also seen as an ongoing mentor in the agency, somebody that they can go to at any time, even after they've been released, to get that reinforcement of what they're doing. How do you think I'm doing? You know, be able to have that contact. And I really like the idea that the FTOs have to explain, because I've served also too on the Civil Service Commission, and I've seen sometimes when we're passing through candidates, in some of the books, I'll see questions that I'm wondering why did a candidate get this far without this question being answered?
Yes.
And there usually isn't an opportunity for that person, that reviewer, to explain why they passed them on or did not pass them on. But at this level, I think it's a very good idea to bring this in and make that accountability, and then again that extended connection as a mentor even after you get released. Because like you, I remember I couldn't wait to get away from my training officer. I just wanted to get out there on my own.
Yeah.
But that didn't mean that I didn't check back every now and then to see if everything was going okay, you know. So I do think this is if it's a new part, as you say,
Yes.
I compliment the chief and you for implementing this, because I think it's a piece that I think reinforces everything that I hope that we feel as a city believe that in the competence of our training program and what we're doing before we have an officer working on their own. So I really do think this is an important piece. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. And there's even another, I mean, with all the layers that we've already discussed, I'll get to the final layer. This is the FTO critique form. At the end of the training cycle, each recruit is required to complete an evaluation on their training experience. What the FTO does good, what the FTO does bad, And to an earlier point that was brought up about maybe perhaps a new employee's ability to be honest, this really cements this for me, because information has been brought to my attention and to the training staff's attention that we would have never known had it not been for this critique form. And as a result of this critique form, there have been field training officers that have been removed from the program, either voluntarily or implied, based on the veracity of the statements or things of that nature. Nothing criminal. A lot of it was just their attitude, their demeanor, how they talk to people. Some of these guys get the attitude, not anymore, but there's some kind of boss and they can be, that just doesn't fly. And so generally, this FTO critique form is invaluable to us as a training staff, and it also speaks to the self-assessments that we talked about in the academy, and then also in the core competency, self-awareness. And I'm pleased to announce we also hear a lot of very positive things about our recruits, or about our field training officers, and we want to share those with their primary supervisor, which is their zone sergeant or lieutenant, because there's a lot of good police work out there that's going on, especially from the training side. And I've had recruit officers write things about their experience about the FTO that are very moving, very touching, that this field training officer, and what's really more interesting about this is many of these field training officers I know, and I didn't know that side of them. That's what I have some officers tell me, and some supervisors, that when this particular officer has a recruit, they bring a kind of a newer, higher level of optimism. It gives them purpose. And so this critique here is kind of the final layer. And when we put out applications for additional field training officers, obviously if that field training officer wishes to stay in the program, we're going to look at all the evaluations that he or she received, and that's also going to go into the decision factor when we make our recommendations to the chief. So that concludes kind of about an hour walkthrough of about 90% of the program.
If you want to have a seat, I have some questions. I don't know if you guys have some follow-up questions, but if you want to have a seat. If a recruit is transferred from another agency, do they have to go through the whole training? I heard you say some of them are stellar because maybe they came from another agency, or how does that work?
How that works is, what agencies do they come from? What experiences do they have? What certifications? We have some lateral transfers that may come and they have, maybe they're instructors from another agency, maybe they were field training officers. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis based on the strengths and weaknesses. We have some lateral transfers that actually want to go through the academy, and they feel that because of Kansas and most agencies are very small, they may not even maybe spend a year or two there. Maybe a majority of that time was working in the jail, for example, some of the county sheriff. So it really depends. It's really case by case based on the strengths and weaknesses of that recruit. Unfortunately, we don't have anymore. We had a very recent candidate as a lateral transfer, and he was a little shy about some of the duties of a Topeka police officer based on some of the responsibilities he had in his prior law enforcement. So it was we were kind of talking, trying to gauge that. Unfortunately, he opted out of the hiring process, but it's very case by case. We have several officers that have come, and we put them in what's called a mini academy, where we will address some of the more higher liability items such as driving, firearms, communication, cultural diversity. We kind of orientate them in 30 days, just kind of the nuances of the city of Topeka and our police department. And then I may put them with one of my strongest field training officers, and based on how he or she does, we may release that person within 60 days on their own. So it really depends.
So they can all get released at different times?
Yes.
Okay, so not all at the same time?
Not at the same time,
Okay,
yeah.
that was another one of my questions. On your FTO training, I would recommend you invite all of us, as well as all the city council members. I tell
Yes.
you, we went and had, me and Councilman Padilla, we went and ate, well, you've seen us there eating with
Yeah.
the recruits, and with the recruits, and there's nothing like hearing it from their own mouth.
Yes.
When I looked at that picture, they were all smiling, and they're all ready, they're gung-ho, they're ready to go. you know, and it's just different from hearing it from anybody. So I would just recommend that you do that. When you talk about the phases, I was looking at this, the assignments, and in phase 1 you have 6 weeks, phase 2 you got 6 weeks. Okay, phase 4 is only 2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks is the solo evaluation phase. This is the part that I spoke of where the recruit is assigned to the FTO, the original FTO from phase 1, and that final phase is just to allow the recruit to operate independently while the FTO evaluates their ability to act
So
as a
that's the
solo
2
status.
weeks.
Yeah, that's just the 2 weeks, yeah.
Okay.
That's the phase they're in right now.
Okay. I thought I highlighted one more thing. I'll let one of you, Councilwoman Hiller, go ahead. I can come back.
Well, this has been helpful, and I'm really glad we had the second session to follow up, in particular when you walked us through the detail of the reviews and what kinds of things the recruits are reviewed on. What I did, and you were here, I asked some questions last time about, a number of us did, about what was in the training manual.
Yes.
So we ended up getting all 133 pages of it, or 150, or whatever it was. It's like, so I can't find my note as to exactly which 2 sections Lieutenant Cross sent us to look at in particular, but I looked at them. And it was interesting to observe that with all of these improvements, as I read those 2 sections, I thought, you know what? This is so well written, but the words matter. And as I read through, one of them had to do with how somebody establishes like a first encounter, how they handle that first encounter. And what it, I was gonna print it before I came, but I couldn't remember the number, and it's too big a book. But what it described was the importance of the officer asserting their authority. It was like a page, so forgive me for just punching out pieces of it. It all was well done, but what I remember, and it's because I was looking for it, I suppose, was it popped out that what appeared to be most important about the situation was controlling the situation and asserting the authority of the officer, and also to make sure that the officer or officers went home that night. And I thought, okay, if I wasn't here in 2021 after having just been through 2020 and the mission that I have, the words might not have struck me at all. But it occurred to me that maybe a refresh by the officers, or maybe by some advocacy groups, even Chief and I have talked about this a little bit, on what it says, because that's what you go back and refer to. It didn't say, first and foremost, make sure you treat everybody the same, like your review questions did.
Yes.
It didn't say that in the instructions of these of our standards, and this is what, it was like the last thing. It was almost like a footnote to keep that in mind. And I've been thinking as we've gone through this whole process that I'm familiar with that old way of training each other, that it's important that all of our officers go home every night.
Yes.
Yet, if there was a small switch to that it's important that everybody go home every night, if possible, is a big difference in who's included and who we're taking care of in the engagement. And I wondered if, I thought probably I could go back through, and just repencil, it's an update, there's nothing wrong with it, but we've said now that making sure, and I don't know what the best affirmative word is for de-escalation, so I'm sure there is one, but that you establish that if the tenor of that engagement isn't de-escalated when it starts, that you get it there as soon as you can. And obviously sometimes that's work. And also the fact that it doesn't matter, that you need to adjust for, I think that one talked about the behavior of the subject at the time. but switching that language and having it be right up front that no matter what the differences, you can say race and run through about 9 things, but there's probably a word that could be used, no matter what the differences are of that individual in their appearance or behavior from the norm, they all needed to be treated the same. You had some really great language in the review, but I didn't see corresponding language like that in the training manual. And so it was just, it was nice to see the review things, but it might be worth it to go back when somebody has time, right? And see if those priorities that we have talked about, also, what I saw in that, maybe that section and the other one that I read, had to do with always obeying the orders of your superiors, making sure that you did that. And with the with this review process that you're using in training now and building from the bottom up, and with the ABLE initiatives and the kind of a retraining on the fact that you need to speak up if anybody, whether they are superior to you, lateral to you, or below you, if something's not right, you have a responsibility to speak up and intervene if necessary. That traditionally hasn't been there, I'm sure. It wasn't in what I read, but it could be.
Okay, as a matter of fact, as we speak, the training manual is under revision right now. As a matter of fact, the training manual is bouncing through several emails right now with people that are invested in that manual and making edifications and comments. And Lieutenant Cross and I, when the FTO manual, what we've done in the past is we have the training manual, then we have the field training manual, which are both large documents. We're actually going to merge the two so that the FTO manual better mirrors current practices. And I took some notes, and I'll definitely look at that language that you're talking about.
And I couldn't even figure out how to express it just right, and you all do that well. But it might be, the 4 things that I thought of were establishing that respect, that mutual respect from the very start or as soon as possible. Treating everybody the same no matter how they look or how they've delivered their message or their behavior. The goal that everybody comes home and that duty to intercede. Those were the 4 that I thought of. There might be others. But if, as your people review the manual, if those priorities that we brought out of 2020 are in sort of a checklist to test those various sections where they're appropriate, it might be interesting.
Good Chief.
Chairman.
Yes.
I think that the sergeant's hit on the big point. One, the training manual is under revamp. And I think a lot of the language that you're talking about, if you look at the policies of the department, which are much more evolved and reviewed, that are publicly posted on the website as well, there's a lot of that language on there that you talked about. So these training forms, I think you point out a valid point. The training form and the manual itself is in need of a refresh, I think was the words you used. And I think that a lot of the language we have in front of us that's in the policies is just a matter of merging those together. So, and as Sergeant said, that's something that we're undertaking for a variety of reasons. So we're glad that the input was come in and from this committee, and I think it's exactly kind of what this committee's mission is to bring those kind of community expectations forward as we evolve the manual.
And I don't know if this is the right time to bring it up. Chief and I have already met a little bit about it. What struck me as I was thinking about that is I thought, well, okay, we can do all this great training, we can watch everybody once a week, but where's that measure in the long run? How do we make sure it stays that way? And so I asked for copies of the annual review forms. And interestingly enough, for one thing, I think the model is excellent. I think I was very impressed with how it's laid out and how it works. It's got to be a really great functional one when you do the reviews. But interestingly enough, those 4 that I mentioned didn't just jump out at you as priorities in that annual review. And if they're really that important to us now, and maybe it's only because we took it for granted before, but we need to say it and we know that, it might be worth looking at the review forms as well. Because when I'm that recruit even, when I know I'm going to be evaluated on how I handle the first 5 minutes of every engagement, not just how I bring it down, maybe that'll make it more important to me. and so on.
I agree, and I will tell you with a 100% confidence, those values that you spoke of and the respect and dignity piece, that's a significant part of our training. We teach our recruits to start out every encounter nice and to respond and not react. And the response is based on thought process and strategy, where the reaction might be more emotionally driven. So yeah, I understand what you're saying though, and I did take some notes to that, and I want to look at that language myself in more detail, but thank you for that comment though.
You're welcome. And like I say, those are delivered in the context of why we're here and those priorities that have emerged from real situations that were important to people, and not just things they saw on TV, but things that have happened here. But also, it's very reassuring to be offering those in the context of really excellent stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, Chair. I would agree to what Councilwoman Hiller spoke to, but in the wordsmithing that you're going to do, treating everybody the same sounds good, but has never been, for me, the answer to saying, I'm going to treat you exactly like I'm going to treat Council Member Sylvia Ortiz, because there are going to be so many variables. Appropriately, maybe, those other kinds of things. So I think it's good to bring that up, but I think that's something that you think about when you're looking at that, and that I don't know that anybody gets ever treated the same as the person next to him, but appropriately, effectively, objectively, fairly, all those things I think are important to consider. I had a couple questions. One, back on the FTOs, and yeah, I think you may have touched on it, Sergeant. How long does an FTO remain eligible to be one? As long as he's performing well, or can he opt out of it at some point, or how does that kind of work?
Traditionally, it's been 1 year.
Okay.
And that is another area that we are exploring, because there's some field training officers that maybe they don't have the ambition or the desire to promote, but they are leaders without rank. Mm-hmm. And we want to foster that. And so one of the things we're examining is a year enough, especially when you have a really, really solid field training officer that enjoys it, loves it, gives him purpose or her purpose. So that's something we're exploring, but currently it's 1 year.
Yeah. And I thought, I know this, sometimes it's just fluff, but I know from my time with the department, sometimes when you're involved with something like being a field training officer, you kind of stick your chest out about that a little bit, because people know that you've been selected because of your abilities, and I think it's something to be proud of in your career, even whether or not you promote rank-wise, but I think it's something that should be recognized with a level of importance and significance, and I think those opportunities to recognize those who serve in a field training capacity should be given some consideration, either by a special insignia, so that when they're on the scene, people know this person is a very competent police officer who's been entrusted to train new recruits. Just a thought or an idea. I just think that, rank is one thing, but your ability to do a good job, I think, has to be recognized at the same level, in my opinion. Just my 2 cents. And then
it's not public, but we do provide our FTOs with unique indicia they can wear in their uniform, both Class B and Class A, and we do instill in them the pride. But we are exploring the annual FTO selection, because one FTO, for example, was a field training officer for 16 years.
Oh, wow.
But each year he had to reapply, even though he was more than qualified. It became more of kind of a protocol. So we're kind of looking at that idea and kind of examining what that might look like if we extended it, because there's goods and bads on both of it.
Sure. I can see them.
Now, 16 years ain't bad. I've been here 16 years, so I'm all right with the number 16.
We'll get you a pin.
Get your opinion, give her one.
Well, you don't want to move them on just when they got good.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
That's
Yeah, I
what kind of started the conversation.
Yeah, real good role models within your agency, basically, is how I see them. And I don't know if you covered this piece or not, and I'm guessing you do it somewhere in there, but it's not in this material. I remember, and you may have been the last one who invited me, now that I think about it, to partake of a panel discussion with recruits somewhere in the training cycle with recruits' spouses or significant others, because that's an area sometimes, well, let's say as an FTO, you may not have firsthand insight into a family situation, but your recruit may have some issues going on that, you become aware of during their time together and stuff. And I know at one time that was something that you guys did. I think you still do it, but I didn't know in what capacity, so that way, there is an effect on families and partners when you're going through this training.
Yes, yes and no. It's a long-standing tradition that we have what's called a family night. We facilitate that, and we invite active duty officers who are tenured and have been on the department to bring their spouses, and then we invite the recruits to bring their loved ones, and we create an interaction where the spouses or loved ones could speak to one another on a more unofficial, just social gathering, and then the pandemic hit. And so we had to neutralize that event, and the pandemic lasted a year, so it affected 2 training cycles. So here we are again now, and it may also affect the ability for us to do that.
Sure.
So yes and no. There is a lot of value to that. We have every intention to continue to do that practice, except right now we're just on uncertain times right now what that looks like.
Understood. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Kind of hard
Thank
to
you,
have
Chair.
those sort of side conversations in a chat, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Is there anything else? Chief, would you like to close us out on this one?
Sure, I appreciate that opportunity. Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, I would reiterate, excellent job by Sergeant Salamanca in the presentation. But I think the question that struck me, and I wrote down a few notes as we were going through this, is it's kind of one of the age-old questions we have in police. As a recruit and the people that you're looking for and the people that you bring into the agency as police officers, how do you teach maturity and character?
Yeah.
Well, I think Sergeant Salamanca just gave you some points about how you do that. I mean, the individualized approach to the development by pairing them out through the process and day-to-day notations on how they're doing, week-to-week evaluations where they look at themselves, the whole programming of how do you make this specific to that individual, the weaknesses, the challenges, and how do you develop them? That's the first step. I think the constant evolution of the training section and the lack of fear and the ego that we have that we're not vested in one way, we'll look at it. If we can do it better, we'll change, we'll evolve. And then the last part that I really liked, and Deputy Mayor Padilla spoke a little bit about it, that piece of ingraining in them the pattern of self-evaluation on a daily basis from their activities doesn't end when they're done with the training. That becomes part of how your thought process is, how you end your shift every day, and how you think about what you did. All the tie-ins that you were talking about to character and integrity. Because you think every day in those category terms that were broken out. How did I do this with the officer safety? How did I do this with my radio control? How did I do this? That becomes the normal way that you think as you're off duty on that shift. When you're driving home, becomes a pattern. And that's the base. We get good base people from the beginning. We bring them all along the way through a supportive, individualized approach. We look at new methods and how people are doing things all over the country. And then we ingrain this self-assessment and these honest assessments back and forth between the recruit officers, the field training officers. That makes the entire agency better because the individuals are better on both sides, the recruits and the training officers. So to me, that age-old question, this is pretty far along down that road, is how you do it. You get really good people and you make them better through the process that you have. And the last point I wanted to make that's not quite as rosy, the most important piece about this is the level of professionalism that all of this documentation goes into. When we get into situations where somebody is not cut out to be a police officer or doesn't meet our standard. We have to have all of those things documented for that employment end, just as well as all the success. That vetting process has to go both ways, and that's the level of documentation that you saw that we go through for each and every recruit officer as they move through this process. I think it's very impressive, and I think as a chief, when I get that final memo that says there's a problem, we saw it coming through the different phases. I always know about it as we're moving through those phases. That's how I know the system's working, because we have things written down, but we have to make sure that they're working. And when we have these stories where these officers are not cut out or not meet our level, that documentation shows what we did along the way. So those were the points that I wanted to make. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Anything else before we move on?
But could I ask one question?
Sergeant, just a second. Sergeant Salamanca, how long have you been on the force?
For 21 years.
21 years. So your number's 21. I'm right behind you, but your number's 21. Okay. Karen?
You're talking about how new this is and how evolutionary it is and how good it is, and I think we all agree. What would you say in terms of whether that, obviously you wouldn't stay as close to someone who's been on the force for 15 years as you do when they've been on for 2 weeks, but how are we doing with that model moving up through the tenure of officers and the ranks of officers at this point? Any answer being okay, just curious how we are.
I think I'd like to point back to some of the answer that you gave before. I mean, this dovetails in pretty well, as you saw with the ABLE program. And it's about building those relationships and the rapport would be my take on it. I think Sergeant Salamanca sees it, and then I think he alluded a little bit to it. There's a lot of really touching stories about how the relationships develop, and I think those things progress. I can speak to it in my 28 years. The training officers and the people that you develop relationships with, that you come to trust their opinions and respect, you go to them as mentors throughout your career. So that's what I would tell you. I don't know if that answered it, but it's
a
kind
little
of
arm's length for me, of course, because I've not been in the department. But of course, we're here because people have complained that not everybody has met those standards, either based on an incident or maybe over time. And so what we're looking at is, do we have everything embedded all the way up and down the line in our department today, understanding that everything's evolving, but are there ways that we can improve? Or are we already on, or is it yes, but we're already on track with it, or yes, but we've gotten some ahas out of this process, and
I think it's all of those. I think it's all of those. I think we are trending in the right direction. I think we are constantly evolving. As you said, we're talking about a training manual that we're moving forward. The language pieces of that are going to be very important. But I absolutely think we're moving in the right direction. But we have aha moments, or I can speak to my personal experience in this committee. I have an aha moment every time we have one of these committee meetings. I always take at least a few pieces away, and I know Sergeant has from his participation today. So I think yes was the answer to almost every one of that multi-layered question that you did. Yes, we're moving in the right direction. Yes, we are going to continue to evolve, and we're not going to stop. And yes, we don't do everything perfect every single time, and we learn from those experiences and move forward too. But the expectation levels that we have is the important piece that doesn't move.
well, I think the success that you're having at this point from the bottom up is good. I got what's printed out in print, a 3-page email from a constituent who has been following all of this, and something that he pointed out, which I think we're seeing as well, but he said he'd gone through basically a full culture change when he was working at Menninger some years ago, and how it was at first lots of resistance for changing both the methods of working with people as well as how they managed internally that management process. But in time, it really changed and improved how they worked with patients and with each other. And I can't even share the text with you, but the point that he made kind of wrapped up with was it took the leadership exemplifying every one of those values every day also, so that it was clear that it wasn't just what was being requested of the rank and file up and down the line workers, but that it was really from the day you started training till the day you were at whatever sort of administrative level, that it really, that leadership through the organization also made a difference. And so it's great to have you here and to be talking about how we work both ends against the middle, if you will.
It's great for us too. I mean, we get a tremendous amount of feedback from this, and that's a great perspective to have.
Yeah. Looking
you.
through the lens. All righty. I know our agenda calls for, it's already 4:30 and it calls for qualified immunity. Do we want to start that, or do we want to?
Of course, Shelley's been on.
I know. I don't know. You want to go ahead and
Good night.
Thank you, Sergeant.
let's go ahead and start that. Let's go ahead, and we'll probably not going to get through the whole thing. Shelley?
I'm here.
Okay, do you want to go ahead and start? I apologize. We probably won't get through everything, but we'll try to. I don't want you to rush. I don't want that, because we've been waiting on this for quite a while, okay?
Certainly. This presentation is explaining qualified immunity, but it's at a high level, not getting into the weeds as much. So it should go fairly quickly unless there's lots and lots of questions, which is fine also. So let me give you my...
Shelley, would you identify yourself, please?
Yes. Let me see if I have the right screen here. Yes, my name is Shelley Starr, and I am the Chief of Litigation and have been for 12 years. So, and are you seeing my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So qualified immunity is, well, actually, the question that I was asked to address also is the ability to affect qualified immunity at the municipal level also. So this overview will look at that with that in mind. Okay, and I'm not sure. Next page, how do I do that? How about that?
Yep.
Yes, so just to let everybody know, constitutional rights were guaranteed to all citizens in 1871. So this is not a new thing. This is something that has, a lot like the police department, evolved over a very long time. But constitutional rights have been the norm for all citizens since 1871. Currently, the way we see qualified immunity now is as it's interpreted under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was signed by, I believe it was Johnson in 1964. And it's not called the Ku Klux Klan Act anymore, it's called the Civil Rights Act. The qualified immunity, and there's also absolute immunity under the Civil Rights Act and other laws, but they were first applied actually under the common law well before the Civil Rights Act was instituted. But it was first applied, it's a judicial doctrine, and I feel like I'm not looking at the screen, I'm looking here. So I apologize for that. It's kind of confusing. I have three screens. But it was first applied in 1982 in a case called Harlow versus Fitzgerald. But all of this is federal law. And so part of the issue is what can we do as a municipality with regard to federal law? And honestly, there's really nothing that we could pass that would change federal law. We can't change the statutes and we can't change the cases. What is qualified immunity? It has to do with a government official. It does not apply to the municipality itself. It applies to, it's a personal immunity. It goes to the person and what the person did. And that person has to be acting under color of state law, and the actions have to be reasonable. Reasonableness is the touchstone of the immunities. The illegality of the action must be clearly established. You have to give the official fair warning that what they did or didn't do was illegal. And it is immunity from suit, not from damages. So we always try to, if we are choosing to assert that immunity, we try to do it as early in the litigation as possible. Because once you get well into the case, it's already costing you the time, it's already costing you the money. Qualified immunity is designed to balance two important interests: the need to hold government officials accountable for any misconduct that they've done, hold them accountable through the judicial process. And then the other side of the coin, though, is that unchecked lawsuits create a chilling effect on beneficial police behavior. And they cause the city and the officials to devote undue energy to and money to litigation instead of public safety, which is what they're being paid to do. So when you're balancing the interests, police officers are often forced to make split-second decisions. This is directly out of the Graham versus Connor case, but police officers are forced to make split-second decisions. They don't have the benefit of slow-mo and going back over the scenario. It's often happening in a very quickly evolving and maybe very dangerous situation. On the flip side, the court views that officer's actions objectively, not based on what the officer may or may not have been thinking or without regard to their underlying intent. Again, like I said before, the touchstone is, were the actions reasonable? Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are two types of immunity. There's absolute immunity and qualified immunity. Absolute immunity, and people may be surprised to know this, but the president has absolute immunity under Section 1983. Legislators, such as the governing body, when they're passing laws and discussing those, prosecutors, judges, and witnesses all have absolute immunity. And that is, it's important to our system. Otherwise, people would shut down. They wouldn't be able to do their jobs. On the other side of the equation is qualified immunity, and that's available for people who, like police officers, who utilize a high level of discretion in their jobs, and when they're acting under color of law and in good faith. Now, I just said it's objective and they don't look at the intent, but when we're training our officers and telling them that, there's a case out there and here's the facts, and you need to do this, that, or the other, almost never are two scenarios exactly the same. So if they're trying to follow the law in good faith, then they should have qualified immunity. And again, the actions are judged under an objective standard. Qualified immunity is available to essentially prison officials, social services workers, dispatchers, and emergency medical services providers. The medical services providers, the case that I'm citing is a tort claims case, but it utilizes pretty much the same the same standard as the qualified immunity. But when it comes right down to it, there is a vast body of statute and more in the line of cases that interpret the Civil Rights Act and what it means and what's clearly established law. What are they on notice that they should know? And so the direct power to change qualified immunity really lies with Congress and the Supreme Court. And there's lots of talk about the Supreme Court wanting to revisit how qualified immunity is analyzed and what they're going to do about it, because it is a judicial, it's a judicial construct. So we'll see what the Supreme Court does in the future with regard to that. But for our purposes, the city cannot pass an ordinance that would change how federal courts do their job, interpret cases, or so on. Qualified immunity simply can't be eliminated at the municipal level. And that's all I have for my presentation, but I'm guessing there may be some questions.
Are there some questions? Karen?
Thank you, and thank you, Shelley. That's a really good framework for the discussion, I think. I think in the various articles that have been passed around and opinions that have been passed around, that reasonable action seems to be the drill down in terms of, okay, what's reasonable? What would someone consider reasonable? And as a city, for instance, for unnecessary use of force, if we don't want that to happen, how do we set our standard, and how, with qualified immunity, do we protect our citizens from unnecessary use of force? I'm just using that as an example, but it's one that certainly has come up. And so it appeared to, in some of the more detailed descriptions, that what the city's training standards were, what that officer should have known, and also what the policies were, and how much discretion, either by policy or by practice, was given to an officer could affect the assessment of whether that officer's action was reasonable or not. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think one of the things that you're asking about is, so with qualified immunity, it's a personal immunity. That doesn't mean that the city doesn't have some possible liability, because there's also, they're called Monell claims, and that is because there's a case that says that a city can be sued even though they're not a person under Section 1983 if their policies are the direct cause of the constitutional injury. So, in other words, if we're training people to go out and, beat someone unreasonably, then the city's going to be held liable, and qualified immunity doesn't apply to that situation. In our case, because as you can tell by the previous presentation, we're constantly evolving, constantly reviewing our procedures. We're constantly reviewing every use of force. We are addressing any sort of shortcomings or retraining if there's an issue there. We have a very robust system for uses of force. And so if you look at historically, the city has had very good success in defending claims, because while things may look rough to the public when they're viewing a raw body-worn camera footage, a lot of things aren't on the video. a lot of things that go into the officer's decision are simply not, they're beyond what the public knows about police work and training and what is and is not a danger to the police officer that they have to protect themselves from. So, but we have very robust training with the city of Topeka, and I'm very comfortable with that.
Okay, even in a situation where there was perhaps an excessive use of force, the officer would still have qualified immunity. It would just be, it would come back on the city, is what you're saying, if somehow our policies or our supervisory practices had somehow let this, something that was beyond our expectations to go through?
If the training or the supervision was the cause of the constitutional violation, i.e. we did it that way because that's how we were trained, then yes, there would be liability on the part of the city for that.
But the officer himself or herself would still have the immunity if they'd done the best that they could?
Maybe. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, without knowing the situation, I can't
Understood.
answer that directly.
I mean, if it wasn't reasonable, according to the judge, then they could have an issue.
Right.
Okay, I'm one of the people that's raised those issues just in terms of if there were some things that we considered, some behaviors that had occurred that people weren't comfortable seeing. Was there something that we could or should do about our training, our supervision, or our evaluations, even training what discretion means, let's say, if there was anything we could do to kind of up the baseline, if you will, and if we're already as good as we can be, that's okay too. That was my question, part of it anyway.
Well, I think as Chief Willis said, you know, we're constantly evolving, constantly reviewing things, constantly looking at what other cities are doing and trying to improve ourselves always. So, and I think that the kudos to our training department because they do a very good job.
Thank you.
Mike, did you have anything?
Well, I was just wondering, I just don't want to ask hypotheticals because I don't know that that's practical and helpful. But I'm trying to think of any time that I've been associated with the police department where that was a claim made by an officer for actions taken. So while that has been brought up as an issue, it's kind of like if it hasn't been used, then obviously we're very aware of our responsibility to make sure that we have set the standards high enough that we would not be in a position to have to defend poor training practices or poor field practices because we've done everything we can to ensure and continue to change our procedures, our policies to make sure that we don't violate persons' rights or abuse them except in any way so that someone would believe that the department accepts that as any kind of practice or performance level for this department. So I appreciate getting the history of it because I think, I know I have run into situations since being on the council where people have the understanding that the city council can do some things that we just cannot do. And I think this makes it pretty clear of what the boundaries of our authority is. And I don't think it's a, excuse the pun, cop-out to say that we're doing everything we can because I think that's been proven in this months-long presentation of what we are doing as a agency and as a city to make sure our employees, Topeka police officers, are performing their responsibilities and duties within the boundaries of what is acceptable and not stepping outside of those boundaries. I think corrective action is being applied when it needs to be. I don't think that that's a quick get out of jail card that people have sought to use. I just don't think that it would hold any water in doing that. So I do appreciate the presentation from Shelley. I know that people will still have questions about this and still feel like that has to be addressed. I think we're trying to address it as fairly and as objectively as we can as a body. So again, just my comments, and again, thank you, Shelley, for the presentation.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I too, Shelley, want to thank you because I've got emails, phone calls that they want us to run some type of ordinance or, to do away with qualified immunity. And I knew from the start that what it entailed, but I just think it was important to bring it through this committee so that people could get a clear understanding. I'm not an attorney, you are. And I think it's very important, and they'll have other questions, and we'll address those when we get those. But as for now, we appreciate it. I appreciate you going back to the history because I think that's important. I think it's important that we know the history of this even before George Floyd days, and so that's why I did ask you to include that. And that was interesting of the new name. I didn't know that. So I appreciate that. Chief, do you have anything to add to that? Appreciate your you weighing in on this, and thank you for your presentation. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Okay. So we have progressive correction action, and we have 9 minutes, and I'm going to adjourn this meeting, and we will pick that up on the next go-around. Okay? With all that said, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chief.
Sure.
Chief, I want to